I greet all the distinguished guests that the previous speakers have greeted, but I won't list them all. When we began the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, we asked ourselves, what would success look like? It never occurred to me to define success as a meeting in Panama devoted to the social determinants of health. But if I'd had the creativity, that would have been the very definition of success. And to hear the Speaker of the Assembly of Panama quote what I said about social justice and health, that would have been an even further definition of success. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. When she welcomed us, Carmen said that the audience had to do some work, had to be active. Well, in that theme, I'm going to invite you to be active. I'm going to talk about research from other parts of the world, and your role is to think how that applies to your own society. Because I'm not today going to talk about Panama. Tomorrow I will talk much more about Latin America and the Caribbean. But this evening, your task is to think how it applies. The major burden of health is socially determined. We, as you heard from the Director General, we define social determinants of health as the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. I can't actually see my own slides, which is slightly confusing. And inequities in power, money, and resources. And health equity we define as the systematic social, or rather health inequity, the systematic inequalities in health between social groups that are not avoided are unfair, inequitable. I also remind you that it's very easy to slip into a false equation, equating health and health care. They are not the same thing. And people start talking about health, and then it's almost a reflex. Healthcare, healthcare, healthcare comes out. Health and healthcare are not the same thing. Healthcare is what we need when we get sick. Health is determined by the conditions of society, and we don't solve that simply by more health care. Health care is vital when we get sick. Lots of health ministries have a passion for building hospitals. If it makes them happy, I think it must be a good thing to do. But that isn't what determines the health status of the population. It's the social conditions. Yesterday, when I was talking to the Assembly, I made the link between health and crime. In my book, The Health Gap, I wrote about the US city of Baltimore. And I was giving a talk in the US about the health gap. And a month before I was giving my talk, Baltimore erupted. The precipitant of the civil unrest in Baltimore was the killing of a black man in police custody. Or should I say, one more killing of a black man in police custody. If you're keeping track, the killing of black men in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and in Minnesota this year were killings number 134 and 135 by the police. That was the precipitant of the civil unrest in Baltimore. But the underlying cause was inequality of social and economic conditions. When people have no hope for the future, they have nothing to lose by rioting. Now, when I say that Baltimore erupted, I'm being slightly inaccurate. It was one part of Baltimore that erupted, Upton Druid. And I'd pointed to the fact that life expectancy for men in Upton Druid was 63, and in the wealthy part of Baltimore, it was 83, a 20-year gap in male life expectancy in one US city. If you're living in the rich part of Baltimore and you want to see what it looks like to live in a society where life expectancy is 20 years shorter, you could fly to Ethiopia. Or alternatively, you could just go to the other side of town and see a life expectancy of 63, 2 years shorter than the average in India. I was at a meeting at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and a couple of young doctors kidnapped me and said, "You cannot sit here in this meeting place and not see Baltimore." And we started in Upton Druid. In Upton Druid, there are some streets where every second house has a diagonal red cross on the door. That means that that house has been condemned as unfit for human habitation. Can you imagine what it's like to live on a street where every second house has been condemned as unfit? The red cross on the door means that if there's an emergency, the emergency services will not go in there. Median family income in 2010 was $17,000. I'd like you to remember that figure of 17,000 because I'll come back to it. The kids did poorly in school, badly in reading, high dropout rates, high rates of absence. 90% did not go on to college. Now look at this next one. Each year, 1/3 of youngsters aged 10 to 17 were arrested for some juvenile disorder. 1/3 each year. That means the chance of getting to 17 without a criminal arrest is very small. In theory, the slate is wiped clean at 18, no criminal record. So at 18, you go for a job and you're asked, have you ever been in trouble with the police? You could lie, but that's not a very good qualification for getting a job. Or you could tell the truth, and that's not a very good qualification for getting a job, given this history. So you can see why life is blighted. And then, of course, there's the American disease, guns. In 2005 to 2009, there were 100 non-fatal shootings for every 10,000 residents and 40 homicides, fatal shootings. And then the doctors, these young doctors, took me to Roland Park. Beautiful, leafy, nice trees, nice lawns, where the Johns Hopkins professors live. 93% two-parent families. Median family income was not $17,000, but $90,000. The kids do well in school, that hardly any of them miss school. 75% complete college. Juvenile arrests were not 1/3, but 1 in 50 each year. In the rich part of Baltimore, young people stay out of the clutches of the police and the gangs, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. There were no non-fatal shootings and 4 homicides as distinct from 40. And to remind you, the life expectancy gap was 20 years. Now, I don't think that ill health causes civil unrest. And I don't think that civil unrest causes ill health. The link is relative inequality of social and economic conditions that lead both to ill health and to crime. And part of my case for cross-government action on the social determinants of health is there will be a great deal of other benefit. Reduced crime, a more educated population, and all the good things that follow, as well as the health. Now, I've contrasted the poor, and I say I want you to remember $17,000, because that doesn't sound very poor, does it, in a Panamanian context? And I'll talk about that. But I want you to contrast, I've been contrasting the poor with the rich. My major theme has been that inequalities in health are not confined to the differences between rich and poor, but health follows a social gradient. These are still US data, looking at life expectancy for black women, black men, and white men by years of education. And what you can see is the more years of education, the longer the life expectancy. It's not simply the poor versus the rich. It's a gradient. It affects everybody. And that everybody is quite important. This was a paper published at the end of last year by Anne Case and Angus Dayton. It's looking at mortality rates for men and women aged 45 to 54 in different countries. France, Germany, UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden, big differences among these countries, but in all of them, the mortality has been coming down. And it's been coming down in US Hispanics. But look at US non-Hispanic whites. Oh my goodness, the mortality's going up. And the steepness of the rise was related to the years of education. The fewer the years of education, the steeper the rise. The gradient is getting steeper. And this, colleagues, is not a healthcare issue. What were the causes underlying that constitute this rise in mortality? Number one, poisonings due to drugs and alcohol. Number two, suicide. Number three, chronic liver disease related to alcohol. And then other violent causes of death. In my terms, this is an epidemic of disempowerment, or as Angus Deaton, who co-author, said, an epidemic of despair. And I have some thoughts as to how this comes about, and I will talk about it as I go through. And these are British data. I mentioned to the Minister and Vice Minister of Health today that we've been monitoring health inequalities and social determinants of health inequalities in Britain on a regular basis. Each dot here represents a neighbourhood in England. It's every neighbourhood in England. The top graph is life expectancy, and neighbourhoods are classified by degree of deprivation. As you look at this graph, to the right are the most affluent neighbourhoods, and to the left are the most deprived. What you can see is that people whose level of affluence of their neighbourhood is near the top have shorter life expectancy than the very top. Those a third of the way from the top, shorter life expectancy than those near the top. Those in the middle, shorter than near the top. And all the way from top to bottom, it is a gradient. The bottom graph, the green, is disability-free life expectancy. The gradient is steeper. The difference between the 5th centile and the 95th centile is 17 years. Why am I emphasizing the gradient? Because it changes everything. As long as you think that health inequalities are confined to the difference between the poor and everybody else, then conceptually it's pretty simple. Reduce poverty. You notice I said conceptually it's simple. Practically and politically it may be complicated, but conceptually it's simple. But the gradient means that you and I are involved. If there's a 17-year gap in disability-free life expectancy, it means on average, the average person has 8 fewer years of healthy life. 8 fewer years of healthy life means earlier onset of decline in grip strength, earlier onset of difficulty walking, earlier onset of declining cognitive function, and of course, fewer years of life. We're all involved, you and I. And that means, in addition to reducing poverty, we have to improve society across the whole social gradient. And so when people ask me, why should I care? I'm not poor. And my answer is because we're all involved. Suppose you were a 15-year-old American boy. Go into a school, count 100, typical boys just like you. 13 of you will die before your 60th birthday. Is 13 out of 100 a lot? It's double the Swedish figure. It's higher than in virtually every European country. It's higher than in Costa Rica, Cuba, and Chile. In fact, there are 194 member states of the World Health Organization, and 49 countries are doing better than the US. The US ranks 50th on this measure. We're all involved. And the gradient is very widespread. In many countries, we don't have measures of adult mortality. This is under 5 mortality, which come from demographic and health surveys. And these are wealth quintiles. And you can see in country after country the social gradient. If you were in the second bottom quintile in India, I don't think you would say, well, let's just focus on the poor, the bottom 20%. You'd say, why can't my children have the same survival chance as the top quintile in India? And if you were in the top quintile in India, I think it would be reasonable to ask, why don't my children have the same survival chance as the bottom quintile in Peru? And if you were in the top quintile in Peru, that's pretty rich. Under 5 mortality, about 15 per thousand in the top quintile. You might well ask, why don't my children have the same survival chance as in Iceland with 2 per thousand live births? The gradient means we've got to improve everything for the whole of society. We want to level up, not level down, level up and improve things for everybody. Now, I asked you to remember, just want to make sure you're concentrating, what the household income was of the poor in Baltimore. $17,000, thank you. The Preston curve plots life expectancy for countries against national income in purchasing power parities adjusted to the US dollar. And what you can see here is at very low levels of income, a small increase in national income is associated with a big increase in life expectancy. Makes sense, doesn't it? If you've got very little money, a bit more money will make a difference. Better food, some shelter, pipe clean water, and the like. But then what you see is when you get up to about $13,000, which just happens to be the national income of Costa Rica at purchasing power parities. Purchasing power parities, what the economist calls the Big Mac index, how much you have to pay for a McDonald's quarter pounder, adjust that the official exchange rates don't tell you. So when you get up to $13,000 adjusting for purchasing power, Costa Rica has a male life expectancy of 77. Wait a minute, I just told you $17,000 in the poor of Baltimore, life expectancy 63. Costa Rica, life expectancy for men 77, and their income is $4,000 lower. What does it mean to be poor? The poor of Baltimore are fantastically rich on a global scale. And yet, when I visited Upton Druid in Baltimore, I had no doubt at all that I was seeing poverty. It's not just how much money you have, but what you can do with what you have. And what you can do with what you have very much relates to social conditions. If $17,000 is not enough to get you housing without a diagonal Red Cross on the door, if $17,000 doesn't get you decent transport or allow you to feed your children, then that relative poverty is poverty of social conditions. Because if you look at that graph and you go from Cuba, Costa Rica, Mexico, all the way out to Luxembourg, bless you, all the way out to Luxembourg, Gesundheit, with national income of $80,000, there's simply no relation between national income and life expectancy. Getting richer for a country is not the way to better health once you're above that threshold of absolute deprivation. Improvement of social conditions is the way to do it. So, how do we do it? What do I mean by improvement of social conditions? We take a life course approach. We start at the beginning of life. Give every child the best start in life. When we published the report of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, I was trying to make the case that we need to make common cause between inequalities between countries and inequalities within countries. Just as I said, the poor of Baltimore have the same life expectancy as in Ethiopia. In Glasgow, the Scottish city of Glasgow, people in the poorest part, men, had life expectancy of 54, and in the richest part, 82. And the poorest part was Calton. A policeman came to see me. I'm old enough now that I don't get scared when policemen come to see me. When I was a bit younger, I used to worry, but now. He was a detective chief superintendent, and he came to see me because he said what I was saying on social determinants of health related to what he was saying about crime. Famously, this policeman was asked, he was a detective chief superintendent, would he like another 100 police officers on the beat? And he said no. I'd prefer 100 health visitors who visited families with young children. Investing in early child development would do more to reduce the murder rate in Glasgow than another 100 police officers on the beat. And he told me about Jimmy growing up in Calton. So I've changed the name, but the details are what the policeman told me about. Jimmy had a single mother who had a succession of male partners, each of whom abused Jimmy physically, if not sexually. By the time he got to school, he was labeled with behavior problems. As soon as he was old enough, he was labeled as a delinquent. He was involved in gangs of one form or another. He never had a proper job. Any money he gets goes into drink and drugs. He has a diet, if you could call it that, of pub food, fast food. He had a series of short-term girlfriends, each of whom threw him out because there were questions of alcohol-fueled violent behavior. And his life expectancy is 8 years fewer than the Indian average. Now, some people in public health think that the reason poor people have bad health is because they don't look after themselves. They eat badly, and they smoke, and they don't listen to health advice. I won't try and reproduce a Scottish accent, A, because I can't, and B, because if I could, you wouldn't understand me. But I invite you to conduct a thought experiment and go into Glasgow and say to Jimmy, you really shouldn't smoke, and you should start eating properly and put the knife away and stop beating up your girlfriends and get a proper job. And you can guess what Jimmy would say. The second word would be off, and you can make up what the first word might be. I don't think that would be very helpful. Jimmy is not behaving the way he does because of ignorance. It's not because he fails to understand that smoking is bad for health. He just doesn't care. He's got other priorities. You want Jimmy to behave properly, give him a stable early childhood. Let him have a decent education. Give him life chances. And then if he chooses to do those things, that's up to Jimmy. But don't blame him for his tragic life history. And looking at this more generally, this comes from the 1970 British birth cohort. And it's looking at cognitive development of children from age 22 months to 10 years of age. Look first at children who were in the 10th centile at 22 months of cognitive development. I can't point, but it's the ones down the bottom there. If they grow up in families of low socioeconomic status, they remain low. Their cognitive development remains low. There's regression to the mean, but that needn't detain us now. If at 22 months they were in the 10th centile, but they grow up in families of high socioeconomic status, they catch up. Their relative position improves dramatically. Now look at the children at the top, who at 22 months were in the 90th centile. In other words, good cognitive development. If they grow up in families of high socioeconomic status, they remain high. But if they grow up in families of low socioeconomic status, their ranking declines. Let me be really crude about this. If you're dumb and poor, you stay dumb. If you're dumb and rich, just hang in there. It'll all come good. If you're smart and poor, not good enough. Your cognitive function will decline. But if you're smart and rich, you've just got it made. Assume for the moment that all the differences at 22 months are biologically determined. Genes, nutrition, birth trauma and the like. And the association with socioeconomic status is social. The social outweighs, I nearly said the social trumps the biological, but I don't actually want to use that as a verb. The social outweighs the biological. Now, not all the differences at 22 months are biological. The quality of early nurturing makes a huge difference. But it shows how the social environment in which children are growing up has a dramatic effect on their cognitive function. And if their cognitive function is compromised, they're going to do poorly in school. And if they do poorly in school, they're going to be unemployed or get a poor quality job and have low income and live in poor conditions and riot when the police kill somebody. So we've been monitoring early child development. This is the percent of children age 5 who have a good level of development by local authority, every local area in the country. And local authorities are classified by degree of deprivation. Again, to the right, as you look at it, are the most affluent, and to the left, the most deprived. And what you can see is the more affluent the local authority, the higher the percent of children age 5 have a good level of development. The more deprived, the lower the percent. But there's scatter around the line. For a given level of deprivation, some local authorities are doing better than others. And that suggests two strategies to improve early child development. Reduce deprivation, bring the level of development of these most deprived communities up towards the middle. So one strategy is reduce deprivation, and the other is to break the link between deprivation and poor early child development. That's the scatter around the line. I'll skip over that. And I was making the point about early child development leading on to poor education. These are cognitive test scores at age 7 for reading and maths by the number of risk factors present. And you can see the more of these present, the worse the reading scores. Low birth weight, not being breastfed, maternal depression, having a lone parent, low family income, parental unemployment, low maternal qualifications, damp housing, social housing, and area deprivation. They're all remediable. They're all remediable. We could get the reading scores and the math scores of the ones right down the bottom, right up to the level down there, because we could do something about all of those. I did ask you at the beginning of my talk to think about how this applies in your own society. Now, this is from a rich country. We were the 5th largest economy on the planet till we voted for Brexit. Now we're the 6th, and probably next week we'll be the 7th. And God knows where we'll end up. I despair. I used to be good at jokes till we voted for Brexit, and I lost my sense of humor completely. I have no irony left. And if that other guy gets voted president of the US, I can't even finish the sentence. So I said one strategy is reduce poverty. Can we reduce poverty? Well, yeah, we can actually. What this graph shows is child poverty, where child poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. Before and after taxes and social transfers, benefits. So look at Latvia and Sweden. Before taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia is 35%. In Sweden, it's 32%. Remember, child poverty is defined as living in a family with less than 60% of median income. After taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia has gone from 35% to 25%, and in Sweden, it's gone from 32% to 12%. The Swedes are intolerant of child poverty. I was giving the opening address to the American Public Health Association annual meeting 3 years ago in Boston, and I showed the US figures. Child poverty after taxes and transfers is higher than in Latvia. And I looked at this audience of 7,000 people and said, this must be the level of child poverty that you want. Otherwise, you'd vote for a government that did something different, because you could reduce the level of child poverty if you wanted to. Somebody said to me, I think you're talking about redistribution. I said, yeah, the penny dropped. Yes, I am. That's what we do in civilized countries. We reduce the level of child poverty. The Minister of Finance could probably make a bigger difference to inequalities in health than the Minister of Health. Sorry. And I said 2 strategies. One is reduce deprivation, and the second is invest in breaking the link between deprivation and poor early child development. And one way you can do that is preschool enrollment. Look at these countries from Latin America. Cuba has 100% of 3 to 5-year-olds enrolled in preschool. Costa Rica and Chile are right up there. Paraguay, Dominican Republic, and Colombia, low proportions enrolled in preschool. And now the other graph are reading scores in the 6th grade. And the 2 graphs exactly overlap. High enrollment in preschool, better performance and reading scores in the 6th grade. And, as you've already heard me mention, Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile have the longest life expectancy of these 9 countries, and Paraguay, Dominican Republic, and Colombia have the shortest. So it's consistent with good early child development, which can be improved by, for example, preschool, better performance in school, better conditions in adulthood, better health, and longer life expectancy. Are there things we can do to improve health inequalities? Absolutely. And it starts at the beginning of life. Maximizing capabilities and control. That's another way of saying education through the life course. This is looking at infant mortality in different countries by mother's education. In every one of these countries, women with no education have babies more likely to die in the first year of life than women with secondary education or higher. And what you also see here is that the differences between countries in infant mortality are less for women with secondary education. So in other words, if you're in a poor country, quite good to get an education, it removes a lot of the disadvantage of being in that poor country. Education of women makes a difference. Arguably, the number one contributor to the reduction in infant and child mortality globally has been education of women. Important as services to help child survival are, education of women have probably made a bigger contributor. I describe myself as an evidence-based feminist. Empowerment of women will improve not only women's health, it'll improve the health of the next generation. So education is important. And what we see here are PISA scores. PISA is the Program of International Student Assessment that's run by the OECD for 60 countries. For children aged 15, they measure scores on mathematics, literacy, and science. And these are the mathematics scores, classified by the International Social Classification, social and economic classification. So these are quartiles. So look at Finland. It has the highest scores in Europe and a relatively shallow gradient. The children from more deprived backgrounds do worse than the children from well-off backgrounds, and it's a gradient. But it's relatively shallow. The UK, our top group, don't do as well as in Finland, and our bottom group does much worse because we've got a steeper gradient. The US is even worse. I actually skipped over a slide before because I was worried that you might want to go home tonight. And that was looking at inequalities in early childhood. When I said I think I have an explanation for the rise in mortality at age 45 to 54 in the US, they do very poorly in early childhood, ranking along the bottom of OECD countries. They do quite poorly in PISA scores. And I'll get to it in a moment, the bottom half of the income distribution in the US has seen no increase in the last 3 decades. So poor early child development, poor performance in education, and no income growth. The American dream is turning into a nightmare. And mortality is rising. And when we look at gender differences, I do have some encouraging news. Males and females, the yellowy orangey thingy is female. And you can see that enrollment ratios have been going up over time. From the bottom of those lines to the top is over time. Enrollment ratios in secondary school have been going up. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's still less in females than in males. In South and West Asia, the female rise has been much faster than the male rise, but it's still less in females than in males. In Latin America and the Caribbean, enrollment in secondary education is now higher in females than in males, and that's a very welcome development. If you're still willing to listen to me tomorrow, I'll show you that we haven't quite redressed the gender balance in Latin America. I'll show you some evidence, but at least the secondary enrollment ratios have gone up. Fair employment and good work. There's a lot I could say about working conditions, but I won't say it tonight. One of the things we want work to do is to take people out of poverty. These are British data, and it's looking at people below the minimum income threshold in poverty, subdividing households as to whether they have at least one adult working. And what you can see, the paler color, is the majority of households in poverty have at least one adult working. Now, some of our politicians think that people are in poor because they're somehow morally worthless. They're poor because they can't be bothered working. They won't get up in the morning. We've had politicians talk about this. They won't get up in the morning and go out to work. These people are poor not because they're feckless, not because they're morally worthless, not because they're lazy. They're poor because they're badly paid. That's why they're poor. A little bit of evidence is quite helpful. And that relates to ensuring a healthy standard of living. So I've talked about early child development, education, employment and working conditions, and having enough money to live on. This comes from the United Nations Development Programme. It looks at public expenditure on, they call it health, but they mean health care, on health care and education in 2000, and the Human Development Index in 2012. You'll remember that the Human Development Index includes GDP per capita, literacy, and life expectancy. Now, I've suggested in another context that you could give this slide to a class of graduate students and they could argue for a whole semester about causation. But one interpretation is that if yours is the kind of society that spends generously on education and healthcare, yours is likely to be the kind of society that scores well on the Human Development Index. And we can see, looking at OECD countries, that income inequality has increased in most OECD countries. There's been little change in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, and it's actually come down a bit in Greece. I don't know if anybody thinks Greece is the model for their economy right now, so I hardly think we want to put Greece or Turkey up as the examples. Is he sending me a message with the lights? All right, I'm getting the message. I'll finish soon. Or has he just discovered that people can't see the slide? Shall I start again? Shall I go back to the first slide? This is a rant. This is tangential to my talk. Thank you. I want to have a rant. We've been told in Britain that our economy was the envy of the rich world. Our economy was performing better than every other rich economy. That's what we were being told. That's what our politicians were telling us. Really? This is the average real wage index for developed G20 countries between 2007 and 2013. So take 2007 as 100. Australia, gone up 9%, the average real wage index. Canada, gone up 5%. Germany had gone up 3%. The US up 1%. Japan down a little bit. Italy down a lot. The United Kingdom, we're doing the worst. Our politicians were telling us that we were doing the best. I think there is the answer to why we voted Brexit. It's right there. When the Prime Minister said, we're doing wonderfully well, the economy's a great success, and people knew he was lying. That's a lie. When you say something that isn't true, that's called a lie. I could get kicked out of the parliament for saying things like that. But people knew that it was harder to buy a loaf of bread and a pint of milk and enough money to feed the children. It was getting more difficult. And then the population was told, vote to stay in Europe because things will be pretty bad if we vote to come out. Well, they didn't believe what he'd been telling us before, so why believe what he's telling us now? Why am I ranting about British politics here? Because I think there's a general point. A democracy depends on an informed population. And if our politicians are misinforming us systematically, how can we have a proper functioning democracy? And I would argue those of us who are professionally involved in public health have a responsibility to get the evidence out there. I get asked time and again, how do you get policy change? And my response is, I don't know, but I can tell you what I do, which is present the best evidence. And I don't have a political axe to grind. As I said earlier today, when I was meeting in the Ministry of Health, that in Britain I've engaged Conservative politicians and Labour politicians in my agenda. So I don't have a political axe to grind, but I do have an axe to grind about the truth. I'm old-fashioned. I'm modern as distinct from postmodern. I think the truth really matters. The truth really matters. And those of us who are professionally involved in the public health have a responsibility to get the truth out there. That's my rant. Growing old healthily. I've been arguing that health inequalities follow from the fact of social and economic inequalities. All societies have social and economic inequalities. If health follows that social economic gradient, won't all societies have health inequalities? And the answer is, yeah, they probably will. Well, does that mean it's all hopeless and we should go home? Well, no, it doesn't actually, because the magnitude of the gradient varies enormously. Back in Europe, 15 European countries, looking at life expectancy at age 50 by years of education. ISCED, International Social Classification of Education, 0 to 2 is primary, and 5 to 6 is tertiary. You can see SE, Sweden, has the longest life expectancy at 50 for men and women, and a very narrow gap between those with only primary education and those with tertiary. Sweden, Italy, Norway, Malta, high life expectancy, narrow gap. Now look at the other end, Hungary, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, in other words, the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, lower life expectancy and a big gap, a steep gradient. The magnitude of the health inequalities can vary enormously. So yes, they're there in all societies, but we don't have to accept the magnitude that we see. We can make a difference. And there's a global dimension. Indian cotton farmers have a high rate of suicide, 3 times the rate for all India. Am I stretching the causal chain too far? There is an argument that the subsidies to US cotton farmers are depressing the world cotton prices, which means that Indian cotton farmers are right on the edge. Removing the subsidies to US cotton farmers would allow the world price of cotton to rise between 6 and 14%. For an Indian cotton farmer, that's the difference between penury and survival, the difference between clinging on to life and committing suicide. Now you can see that subsidies to US cotton farmers are done for good domestic political reasons, but there is a global dimension to what we do. And I want us just to remember, I talk about local areas, I talk about local government, I talk about national government, and there is a global dimension to what we do. And ill health prevention, we know that's important. We can make a difference to life expectancy gaps, to inequalities in health really quickly. Look at these countries in the Americas. In the 1950s, life expectancy in Peru was 43. In the US was 66. Male life expectancy, 43 to 66. I think that's probably about 23 years. Now, 2005 to 2010, 55 years later, life expectancy for Peru has gone up to above 70. The gap is not 23 years, it's 5 years in 55 years. Overall, the spread is about 7 years. Cuba there now has higher life expectancy than in the US, marginally. The international differences in health, the inequalities between countries, can get smaller really quickly. And so can the inequalities within countries. This is stunting. Low growth in the first year of life in Brazil. The top graph, 1974 to 75, by family income quintile, a steep gradient. The lower the income of the family, the greater the stunting. Next one down, 1989, the gradient shallower. 1996, shallower. 2006-07, the gradient's virtually gone. Arguably, Bolsa Familia, the conditional cash transfer program in Brazil, has taken 50 million households out of poverty. My general message, when we think about health care and think about health, is why send people back to the conditions that made them sick? We need to treat people when they get sick, and we need to improve the conditions that were making people sick in the first place. And that way, colleagues, as the president of the Assembly, I can't say it properly, Nationale, said, in quoting me, we can work together to create more just societies. Thank you.